All the Young Dudes by MsKingBean89. Chapter 90. 5th Year. Owls. 3rd June 1976. Owls were every bit as terrifying and satisfying as Remus had anticipated. He tried to pretend they were nothing more than the usual end-of-the-year exams, but this was almost impossible when everyone else seemed to have lost their heads over it. James had become a veritable recluse, holed up in the library, or behind his bed curtains, obsessively memorising facts and dates he had spent the rest of the year ignoring. Peter occasionally turned very pale and stared, trembling into space. Marlene had taken to ambushing Remus at various intervals throughout the day, demanding that he quiz her on this or that. Only Sirius seemed calm about any of it, which was just typical. When even James had shut him out, he entertained himself by distracting Mary, which had the added benefit of distracting Remus, which was horrible, but bearable. "Go and find a broom cupboard like everyone else," Marlene yelled, on the edge of hysteria, throwing a slipper at the couple. They were wound together on a couch in front of the fireplace. "There's nowhere to go, though," Mary sighed to Remus in the library the day before owls were due to begin. "Sirius won't let me up into your dorm, and boys can't get into ours. And I don't dare get caught in a cupboard somewhere, not with this castle crawling with wannabe Death Eaters." "What?" Remus finally paid attention. "Has someone tried to hurt you, Mary?" "Oh, all the time," she shrugged, with a tired smile. "I'm used to it by now. At least being the only black kid at my primary school prepared me for something." "That's horrible, Mary. I'm sorry." Remus squeezed her hand, feeling genuinely terrible. Mary was a tough girl. He knew. You could get away with saying almost anything about her. She might throw a bit of a strop, but she'd forgive you quickly afterwards, and never hold it against you. Still, this was something else entirely, and it was obviously having an effect. "You're so sweet, Remus," she smiled back kindly, squeezing his hand back. "Don't worry about me, though. I've got Sirius." Remus released her hand, returning to his work before casually asking, "What does he say about it?" "Oh, you know, they will defend me to the death, but nothing they do can ever come between us. To be honest, I think he has a bit of a white knight complex." "Well," Remus closed his book and looked up at her, "you're no damsel in distress." Mary's face split into a lovely grin. She really was very beautiful. "Cheers, Remus. I knew I could count on you to support the women's lib argument. Right, can we go over the Defense Against the Dark Arts paper again? Professor Josky hinted that there would be something on either werewolves or vampires." Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 28. Snape's Worst Memory. He was standing in the middle of the great hall, but the 4 house tables were gone. Instead, there were more than 100 smaller tables, all facing the same way, at each of which sat a student, head bent low, scribbling on a roll of parchment. The only sound was the scratching of quills, and the occasional rustle as somebody adjusted their parchment. It was clearly exam time. Sunshine was streaming through the high windows onto the bent heads, which shone chestnut and copper gold onto the bright light. Harry looked around carefully. Snape had to be here somewhere. This was his memory. And there he was, at a table right behind Harry. Harry stared. Snape the teenager had a stringy, pallid look about him, like a plant kept in the dark. His hair was lank and greasy and was flopping onto the table, his hooked nose barely half an inch from the surface of the parchment as he scribbled. Harry moved around behind Snape and read the heading of the examination paper. Defense Against the Dark Arts, Ordinary Wizarding Level. So Snape had to be 15 or 16, round Harry's own age. His hand was flying across the parchment. He had written at least a foot more than his closest neighbours, and yet his writing was minuscule and cramped. 5 more minutes! The voice made Harry jump. Turning, he saw the top of Professor Flitwick's head moving between the desks a short distance away. Professor Flitwick was walking past a boy with untidy black hair. Very untidy black hair. Harry moved so quickly that, had he been solid, he would have knocked desks flying. Instead, he seemed to slide, dreamlike, across the 2 aisles and up a third. The back of the black-haired boy's head drew nearer. He was straightening up now, putting down his quill, pulling his roll of parchment towards him, so as to reread what he had written. Harry stopped in front of the desk, and gazed down at his 15-year-old father. Excitement exploded in the pit of his stomach. It was as though he was looking at himself, but with deliberate mistakes. James's eyes were hazel, his nose was slightly longer than Harry's, and there was no scar on his forehead. But they had the same thin face, same mouth, same eyebrows. James's hair stuck up at the back exactly as Harry's did. His hands could have been Harry's, and Harry could tell that when James stood up, they would be within an inch of each other's height. James yawned hugely and rumpled his hair, making it even messier than it had been. Then, with a glance towards Professor Flitwick, he turned in his seat and grinned at a boy sitting 4 seats behind him. With another shock of excitement, Harry saw Sirius giving James a thumbs up. Sirius was lounging in his chair at ease, tilting it back on 2 legs. He's very good looking. His dark hair fell into his eyes with a sort of casual elegance neither James's nor Harry's could have ever achieved, and the girl sitting behind him was eyeing him hopefully, though he didn't seem to have noticed. And 2 seats along from this girl, Harry's stomach gave another pleasurable squirm, was Remus Lupin. He looked rather pale and peaky. Was the full moon approaching? And was absorbed in the exam. As he reread his answers, he scratched his chin with the end of his quill, frowning slightly. So that meant Wormtail had to be around here somewhere too. And sure enough, Harry spotted him within seconds. A small mousy-haired boy with a pointed nose. Wormtail looked anxious. He was chewing his fingernails, staring down at his paper, scuffing the ground with his toes. Every now and then, he glanced hopefully at his neighbour's paper. Harry stared at Wormtail for a moment, then back at James. He was now doodling on a bit of scrap parchment. He had drawn a stitch and was now tracing the letters L-E. What did they stand for? "Quills down, please," squeaked Professor Flitwick. "That means you too, Stebbins. Please remain seated while I collect your parchment. Accio." Over 100 rolls of parchment zoomed into the air and into Professor Flitwick's outstretched arms, knocking him backwards off his feet. Several people laughed. A couple of students at the front desks got up, took hold of Professor Flitwick beneath the elbows, and lifted him back onto his feet. Thank you, panted Professor Flitwick. "Very well, everybody. You're free to go." Harry looked down at his father, who hastily crossed out the L-E he had been embellishing, jumped to his feet, and stuffed his quill and the exam paper into his bag, which he slung over his back, and stood waiting for Sirius to join him. Harry looked around and glimpsed Snape a short way away, moving between the tables towards the doors to the entrance hall, still absorbed in his own exam paper. Round-shouldered yet angular, he walked in a twitchy manner that recalled a spider, and his oily hair was jumping about his face. A gang of chattering girls separated Snape from James, Sirius and Lupin, and by planting himself in their midst, Harry managed to keep Snape in sight while straining his ears to catch the voice of James and his friends. "Did you like question 10, Mooney?" asked Sirius as they emerged from the entrance hall. "Loved it," said Lupin briskly. "Give 5 signs that identify the werewolf." "Excellent question." "Do you think you managed to get all the signs?" said James in tones of mock concern. "Think I did," said Lupin, seriously, as they joined the crowd thronging around the front doors, eager to get out into the sunlit grounds. 1. He's sitting on my chair. 2. He's wearing my clothes. 3. His name's Remus Lupin. Wormtail was the only one who didn't laugh. "I got the snout shape, the pupils, the eyes, and the tough tail," he said, anxiously. "But I couldn't think what else." "How thick are you, Wormtail?" said James, impatiently. "You run around with a werewolf once a month." "Keep your voice down," implored Lupin. Harry looked anxiously behind him again. Snape remained close by, still buried in his exam questions, but this was Snape's memory, and Harry was sure that if Snape chose to wander off in a different direction once outside the grounds, he, Harry, would not be able to follow James any further. To his intense relief, however, when James and his 3 friends strode off down the lawn towards the lake, Snape followed, still poring over the exam paper, and apparently with no fixed idea of where he was going. By keeping a little ahead of him, Harry managed to maintain close watch on James and the others. "Well, I thought that paper was a piece of cake," he heard Sirius say. "I'd be surprised if I don't get outstanding on that, at least." "Me too," said James. He put his hand in his pocket and took out a struggling golden snitch. "Where'd you get that?" "Nicked it," James said, casually. He started playing with the snitch, allowing it to fly as much as a foot away before seizing it again. his reflexes were excellent. Wormtail watched him in awe. They stopped in the shade of the very same beech tree on the edge of the lake where Harry, Ron and Hermione had once spent a Sunday finishing their homework, and threw themselves down in the grass. Harry looked over his shoulder yet again and saw, to his delight, that Snape had set himself on the grass in the dense shadow of a clump of bushes. He was deeply immersed in the owl paper as ever, which left Harry free to sit down in the grass between the beech and the bushes to watch the foursome under the tree. Sunlight was dazzling on the smooth surface of the lake, on the bank of which a group of laughing girls who had just left the great hall were sitting, with their shoes and socks off, cooling their feet in the water. Lupin had pulled out a book and was reading. Sirius stared around the students milling over the grass, looking rather haughty and bored, but handsomely so. James was still playing with the snitch, letting it zoom further and further away, almost escaping, but always grabbed it at the last second. Wormtail was watching him with his mouth open. Every time James made a particularly difficult catch, Wormtail gasped and applauded. After 5 minutes of this, Harry wondered why James didn't tell Wormtail to get a grip on himself, but James seemed to be enjoying the attention. Harry noticed that his father had a habit of rumpling up his hair, as though to keep it from getting too tidy, and also kept looking over at the girls by the water's edge. "Put that away, will ya?" said Sirius, finally, as James made a fine catch, and Wormtail let out a cheer, before Wormtail wet himself with excitement. Wormtail turned slightly pink, but James grinned. "If it bothers you," he said, stuffing the snitch back in his pocket. Harry had the distinct impression that Sirius was the only one for whom James would have stopped showing off. "I'm bored," said Sirius. "Wish it was full moon." "You might," said Lupin darkly from behind his book. "We've still got transfiguration. If you're bored, you could test me. Here." He held out his book. But Sirius snorted. "I don't need to look at that rubbish. I know it all." "This'll liven you up, Padfoot," James said quietly. "Look who it is." Sirius's head turned. He became very still, like a dog that had scented a rabbit. "Excellent," he said softly. "Snivellus." Harry turned to see what Sirius was looking at. Snape was on his feet again and was stowing the outer paper in his bag. As he left the shadows of the bushes and set off across the grass, Sirius and James stood up. Lupin and Wormtail remained sitting. Lupin was still staring down at his book, though his eyes were not moving, and a faint frown line had appeared between his eyebrows. Wormtail was looking from Sirius and James to Snape, with a look of avid anticipation on his face. "All right, Snivellus," said James, loudly. Snape reacted so fast, it was as though he had been expecting an attack. Dropping his bag, he plunged his hand inside his robes, and his wand was halfway into the air when James shouted, "Expelliarmus!" Snape's wand flew 12 feet into the air and fell with a little thud in the grass behind him. Sirius let out a bark of laughter. "Impedimenta," he said, pointing his wand at Snape. It was knocked off his feet halfway through a dive towards his own fallen wand. Students all around had turned to watch. Some of them had got to their feet and were edging nearer. Some looked apprehensive, others entertained. Snape lay panting on the ground. James and Sirius advanced on him, wands raised, James glancing over his shoulder at the girls at the water's edge as he went. Wormtail was on his feet now, watching hungrily, edging around Lupin to get a clearer view. "How'd the exam go, Snivelly?" said James. "I was watching him. His nose was touching the parchment," said Sirius viciously. "There'll be great grease marks all over it. They won't be able to read a word." Several people watching laughed. Snape was clearly unpopular. Wormtail snickered shrilly. Snape was trying to get up, but the jinx was still operated on him. He was struggling, as though bound by invisible ropes. "You... wait," he panted, staring up at James with an expression of pure loathing. "You... wait." "Wait for what?" said Sirius, coolly. "What are you going to do, Snivelly? Wipe your nose on us?" Snape let out a stream of mixed swear words and X's, but with his wand 10 feet away, nothing happened. "Wash out your mouth," said James, coldly. "Scourgify." Pink soap bubbles streamed from Snape's mouth at once. The froth was covering his lips, making him gag, choking him. "Leave him alone!" James and Sirius looked round. James's free hand immediately jumped to his hair. It was one of the girls from the lake's edge. She had thick, dark red hair that fell to her shoulders, and startlingly green, almond-shaped eyes. Harry's eyes. Harry's mother. "All right, Evans," said James. The tone of his voice was suddenly pleasant, deeper, more mature. "Leave him alone," Lily repeated. She was looking at James with every sign of great dislike. "What's he done to you?" "Well," said James, appearing to deliberate the point, "it's more the fact that he exists, if you know what I mean." Many of the surrounding students laughed, Sirius and Wormtail included, but Lupin, still apparently intent on his book, didn't, and nor did Lily. "You think you're funny," she said coldly, "but you're just an arrogant, bullying toe-rag, Potter. Leave him alone." "I will if you go out with me, Evans," said James, quickly. "Go on, go out with me, and I'll never lay a wand on old Snivelly again." Behind him, the impediment jinx was wearing off. Snape was beginning to inch towards his fallen wand, spitting out soap suds as he crawled. "I wouldn't go out with you if it was a choice between you and the giant squid," said Lily. "Bad luck, Prongs," said Sirius briskly, and turned back to Snape. "Oi!" But too late. Snape had directed his wand straight at James. There was a flash of light, and a gash appeared on the side of James's face, splatting his robes with blood. James whirled about. A second flash of light later, Snape was hanging upside down in the air, his robes falling over his head to reveal skinny, padded legs and a pair of grey and underpants. Many people in the small crowd cheered. Sirius, James and Wormtail roared with laughter. Lily, whose furious expression had twitched for an instant, as though she was going to smile, said, "Let him down!" "Certainly," said James, and he jerked his wand upwards. Snape fell into it, crumpled deep on the ground. Disentangling himself from his robes, he got quickly up to his feet, wand up, but Sirius said, "Locomotor mortis," and Snape keeled over again at once, rigid as a board. "Leave him alone!" Lily shouted. She had her own wand now. James and Sirius eyed it warily. Evans, don't make me ask you," said James, earnestly. "Take the curse off him, then." James sighed deeply, then turned to Snape and muttered the counter-curse. "There you go," he said, as Snape struggled to his feet. "Lucky Evans was here, Snivellis. I don't need help from filthy little mudbloods like her." Lily blinked. "Fine," she said, coolly. "I won't bother in the future. And I'd wash your pants if I were you, Snivellis." "Apologise to Evans!" James roared at Snape, his wand pointed threateningly at him. "I don't want you to make him apologise," Lily shouted, rounding on James. "You're as bad as he is." "What?" yelped James. "I'd never call you up. You know what? Messing up your hair because you think it looks cool to look like you've just got off your broomstick. Showing off that stupid snitch. Walking down corridors and axing anyone who annoys you, just because you can. I'm surprised your broomstick can get off the ground with that fat head on it. You make me sick." She turned on her heel and hurried away. "Evans!" James shouted after her. "Hey, Evans!" But she didn't look back. "What is it with her?" said James, trying, and failing, to look as though this was a throwaway question of no real importance to him. "Reading between the lines, I'd say she thinks you a bit conceited, mate," said Sirius. "Right," said James. He looked furious now. "Right." There was another flash of light, and Snape was once again hanging upside down in the air. "Who wants to see me take off Snivelly's pants?" But whether James really did take off Snape's pants, Harry never found out.
All the Young Dudes by MsKingBean89. Chapter 90, 5th Year. Owls.
Remus would never know whether it was the increased attacks on Muggleborns, and therefore Mary, that caused the incident which took place after the Defence Against the Dark Arts written exam. He flattered himself, once or twice, that it could have had something to do with Severus's dogged pursuit of Remus, even though Sirius had promised not to retaliate. He liked to think, later on, that James and Sirius had acted out of some kind of righteous indignation, that this was a chance to prove that they had picked a side. In reality, it was probably a mixture of reasons, none of them noble. The high intention of owls, combined with the relief of having just finished an exam, growing tensions that had been simmering all year, In fact, for a number of years, between Gryffindor and Slytherin, Severus Snape simply being an annoying prick, James wanting to impress Lily, Sirius's merciless aggression towards anyone who so much as hinted allegiance to the other side. In short, no one was quite themselves that day, and it was odd. These two factors alone might have been enough to bring that situation to boiling point. The fact that Sirius was playing the bored aristocrat, and that James was eager to please, was nothing new, and could potentially be explained away later as obnoxious teenage behaviour. Besides, those who knew Sirius, and what he had suffered, were inclined to pander him, allow him to put on airs, and James was particularly indulgent. The level of cruelty was certainly new, and could not be explained so easily. Unfortunately, as the years would go on, Remus would see more and more of this ruthlessness, not always from his friends, but certainly from people he had thought were good. It would always seem to Remus that this was the day the war truly started, as far as the Marauders were concerned. Remus did not consider himself blameless, of course. He could have stepped in. He did put down his transfiguration book when Lily got involved, but he'd assumed she would shut everything down, scold James, and move on. He certainly hadn't expected Snape to say what he had said, or for James to do what he did next. Part of him had enjoyed it too. Part of him liked seeing Snape humiliated and tormented, without Mulciber around to back him up. It was horrible to see Lily so insulted, of course. And when James started really going for it, Remus had to bite his lip to keep from cheering and laughing along with everyone else. He ought to have stopped it. He ought to have stood up to his friends, taken control, and been the better man. He just didn't feel like it. Whether or not his intervention would have improved or worsened the situation, or the events that followed, Remus might never know. But he did wish that he had tried. "You've blown any chance you've ever had with being with her now, mate," Sirius laughed, as Lily stormed out of the dining hall later that day, upon seeing James at the table. "Fine," James said, scowling. "Do you know what? I've wasted too much bloody time pining after her, and if that's how she feels..." "Isn't it how she always felt?" Peter asked, pouring out his gravy glumly. Another casualty of the altercation with Snape. Peter and Desdemona had apparently had a blazing row over it. She thought it was bullying. She couldn't see what Snape had done wrong. "Shut it, Pettigrew," Sirius rolled his eyes. He addressed James. "Forget about her, Prongs. She's always been up herself." "Oi!" Mary slapped his thigh, lightly. "Lily's my friend, if you don't mind. Oh, James, I do think you'd better leave her alone for a bit. She's really upset." "Really?" Remus asked, feeling guilty. He ought to have stopped it. "Of course," Mary replied, neatly slicing up her roast potatoes. "Don't ask me why, but Snivellus has been her best friend since they were kids. I've tried telling her what a massive torso he is, but it doesn't really get through. She feels sorry for him, I think. He's madly in love with her, of course." "Ugh, she doesn't like him back, does she?" James looked scandalised. "No," Mary shrugged, "but they're friends all the same. Or at least they were. She's not talking to him now." Remus made a mental note to check whether she was okay. That was, if Lily was still speaking to him. A final outburst had definitely felt like an attack on all the Marauders, not just James. Friday, 12th June 1976. The Transfiguration written exam was the following week, and Remus was over-prepared, if anything. He had a burning desire to beat James, but he couldn't beat Sirius at it. He thought he could probably best him in the written if he couldn't in the practical. The paper was 3 hours long and demanded a huge amount of concentration. Remus only looked up twice, both times to check on Sirius. The first time, he was working on his essay, his quill moving smoothly as though skating over the parchment rather than scribbling away like James or Peter. The second time, he was leaning back on his chair, trying to catch James's eye. Remus sighed. It was so much harder to concentrate this close to the moon. He felt more animal than usual. He was really looking forward to the upcoming moon, as much as he knew it was foolish. It would be the last one of the school year, and all 4 of them had been planning it quietly over the past week. Exams would be finished, and they were practically invincible, with what felt like the whole world at their feet. James swore he had caught a glimpse of a unicorn last time, and they'd been reading up on how to track them down. Remus wasn't sure what the wolf might do, faced with the unicorn, but there was no evidence he would attack. Centaurs were something else altogether. Centaurs terrified the wolf. When the exam finished, the students were instructed to stand back against the walls of the Great Hall while McGonagall magically collected all of the papers alphabetically in the most elegant use of accio Remus had ever seen, and reinstated the house tables ready for dinner. Across the hall, Snape was glaring at James furiously. "Do you know what more he wants?" James twittered. "We've got detention, haven't we?" "Did a teacher see you?" Mary asked as they wended their way over to their usual seats for dinner. "Nah, bloody Evans," Sirius groaned. "My dear friend Lily," Mary said firmly. "Whatever," Sirius grunted. "She just better not drag it out until tomorrow night." "Why?" Mary asked, smiling as dinner appeared on the empty plates before them. Spaghetti bolognese. "Taking me somewhere nice for once." "I think the sixth floor girls' loo is nice," Sirius replied, sarcastically. "Anyway, no. Got something else. We're order business." "Oh, yeah, of course," Mary sighed, as if she was terribly hard done by. "I forgot. I have to share my boyfriend with his boyfriends." James and Peter snickered, but Sirius bristled like a cat. "Fuck's sake," he spat, looking daggers at her from across the table. "Why do you have to say shit like that? Spiteful cow." "Your blood snob," she returned, sweetly, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "Please," Remus said, battling a headache. "Peter and Desdemona are arguing this week. You'll get your turn next week." That made everyone laugh, and went some way to calm the atmosphere. Remus was pleased with himself. He was really getting the hang of the whole relationship thing, without ever having to actually be in one. By the time dinner was over, all was well again, and when James got up to go for detention, Sirius told him he would catch up later. "I want to make sure Mary gets back to the tower, okay?" he explained. "You don't have to," she said. "I'm not going alone. Remus is coming too. Aren't you, Remus?" "Yeah," he nodded, hoisting his book bag up onto his shoulder. "I'm finally going to read something with a plot, now exams are over." "Such a thrilling life you lead, Moony," Sirius smirked. He clasped Mary's hand. "Still, I'd rather come with you, so don't worry." "How can you be such a prick one minute and then so sweet the next?" Mary sighed, kissing him. Remus looked away, politely. That was very much the question with Sirius, he thought. That was exactly what you were getting yourself into with him. "All right, but don't be too long," James said. "Detention is with Filch. Evans is a sadist, I swear." "Won't take 15 minutes, Sirius assured him, and they set off, the three of them, Remus walking just a bit behind the whole way. "Oh, for God's sake," Mary said loudly as they reached the portrait hole, and Remus peered around to see what the hold-up was. Ah, of course, Snape again. Reflexively, Remus reached for his wand. "Look, she's not interested in talking to you, so bugger off," Mary snapped, still holding Sirius's hand. "Black," Severus drooled. "Tell your muggle bitch to shut up." "What did you call me?" Mary shrieked as Sirius whipped out his own wand and raised it. This is the time, Remus thought to himself. This is the time to be a prefect. This is the time to be brave. Sirius had just opened his mouth when Remus stepped forward, standing between the two dark-haired boys. "Stop it now," he said, in his most dangerous voice. "Snape, go back to your own common room or I'll give you detention. Black, just calm down, okay?" Sirius was red in the face and did not lower his wand. Snape cocked an eyebrow. "Listen to him, Black. Even Looney Lupin knows you couldn't beat me in a duel." "That's not what I said," Remus hissed. "Shut up and get lost." "Should I get someone?" Mary asked, nervously watching Sirius's face. "No, it's okay. Just go in," Remus said, watching it crawl through the portrait hole. He turned to Sirius. "Come on, you've got detention now. Let's go." "You're not looking well, Looney Lupin," Severus said, suddenly. Remus turned, confused. "What the hell? Coming up on your time of the month, is it?" The implication was clear. Remus was speechless, shocked. He gaped, finding his voice. You don't know what you're talking about." Snape smiled. obviously thrilled to have wrought such a reaction. He looked at Sirius now. You all know, of course. You and Potter and that little rodent Pettigrew. You know what he is. I always wondered why 3 purebloods would want to waste their time on filthy scum like him. But now I see. He's your little pet project, isn't he, Black? Confrigo, Expelliarmus! Remus and Sirius both shouted their incantations at the same time, but Remus was quicker and had Sirius's wand in his hand before any further damage could be done. He rounded on Snape now. I don't know what you think you know, he said, very low, standing over the Slytherin boy, pointing Chew once directly at his face. But whatever it is, you're wrong. Now get back to the dungeons before I summon McGonagall. Snape, who had paled very slightly, gave a minuscule nod before edging around the Chew Gryffindors and slinking away, down the corridor. Remus didn't take the wands off him until he was definitely gone, and then didn't give Sirius his back until the last moment. Sirius snatched it and glared at him. What'd you do that for? Sirius, do you want another detention? Didn't you hear the things he said about Mary? The things he said about you? Of course I did, Remus folded his arms, coldly. And he's a complete knob. A complete knob who you humiliated yesterday, and who you promised me you wouldn't go after. Yeah, but you promised, Sirius. Remus stared him down. He saw the look in Sirius's eyes. He just realised they were completely alone, and standing quite close. He stepped back, smartly. I know what I said, he replied, his voice still thick with rage. But I won't have him spreading rumours about you. He deserves a taste of his own bloody medicine. Sirius, Remus moaned. Please, just go to your detention and calm down, okay? I'll see you later. Years later, Remus would look back on that conversation with the benefit of hindsight and scold himself for leaving things that way. But they were not yet the men they would become, and as much as Remus liked to think he was mature and intuitive, he was about to learn that he still didn't know the first thing about Sirius. Besides, he didn't have the patience. The moon was coming.